Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the posting of the colors and the playing of the Canadian and American national anthems.
Welcome. Thank you for coming this morning. I'm Dan Innes, the Dean of the College of Business, Public Policy, and Health here at the University of Maine. In 1997, when he retired from the United States Senate, William S. Cohen donated his papers to the University of Maine. When he completed his term as Secretary of Defense, he once again honored the University of Maine by donating those papers to our library. With this rich collection as a foundation, the University of Maine established the William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce. The center's broad mission is to leverage resources within the university to enhance the competitiveness of U.S. businesses, to foster understanding of international policy issues, and to accelerate economic development in Maine and the nation through education, research, and outreach activities. Today's lecture is the fourth in a series of annual William S. Cohen lectures. This is just one of many events and activities that will be sponsored by the William S. Cohen Center in the years to come. In your programs, you will find cards for questions. If you wish to submit a question to Prime Minister Mulroney or to Secretary Cohen, please write it on a card and pass the card to the end of your row, where it will be collected by an usher. Joshua Smith, a PhD student studying the history of Canadian-American relations, will read your questions to the guests at the end of Mr. Mulroney's talk. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you the President of the University of Maine, Dr. Peter Hoff.
Thank you. As you can see, this is what they call in football a flea flicker play, where a series of handoffs. Thank you, Dean Innes. Distinguished guests, students, and members of our faculty and staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Hutchins Auditorium at the University of Maine. We're all very pleased by the excellent turnout for this morning's event. Since its inception 5 years ago, the Cohen Lecture Series has been a real source of pride for this university. Before we get to our distinguished speakers, there are a number of special guests I would like to acknowledge. First, I would like to acknowledge and welcome two members of Secretary Cohen's family. His nephews, Jim and Mark Beckwith, are able to join us this morning. Welcome, Jim and Mark. We're also joined today by a number of civic leaders and other public officials from all over Maine. Too numerous to name, but you're all extremely welcome, and we're proud and honored to have you. So welcome to all of you. And I would also like to acknowledge, yes, thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of several leaders of our state education community, members of the State University System Board of Trustees and the Chancellor's Office, including Chancellor Westphal himself, members of our University of Maine Board of Visitors, presidents of other post-secondary institutions, and principals, teachers, and students from area schools. Thank all of you for joining us today. Also with us today are three officials representing federal and provincial Canadian government agencies. From the Office of the Canadian Consulate, also with us today are three officials from the Consulate General in Boston are Robert Noble and Michael Connors. Representing the Quebec delegation in Boston is Marc Jacques. Welcome to the three of you. And now let me introduce a special friend of the University of Maine, one of the most prominent and distinguished citizens in the history of this state. Bill Cohen is Bangor's favorite son. From humble beginnings, blessed with extraordinary talents and fueled by a remarkable work ethic, his career has made the people of this region and this state very proud that he is one of our own. From Bangor City Hall to the halls of Congress to the Pentagon, Bill Cohen has embodied the traits we all hope for in our leaders and public servants: honest, dignified, hardworking, and absolutely committed to serving the public good. Throughout his career in public life, Bill Cohen has demonstrated the independence and fortitude that mark him as a true Mainer. Political expediency has always taken a back seat to belief in the set of ideals that guide his life and his decisions. That admirable trait has served him well as a city councilor, a member of Congress, a senator, as a member of President Clinton's cabinet, and now as a private citizen. We at the University of Maine are honored by developments in recent years that have connected the name of this institution so closely with that of Secretary Cohen. In his 1997 decision to donate his congressional papers to UMaine followed a year later by a similar donation, that is, not a year later, but several years later. He served for some time as secretary, followed later by a similar donation of records from his years at the Defense Department. Leave us both humbled and grateful. The University of Maine is the foremost repository of the public records of Bill Cohen's remarkable life and will remain so forever. We are proud to be the home of this collection, which is an outstanding source of scholarship and research. We are also fortunate that Secretary Cohen has been willing to lend not only his name, but his expertise and advice as chair of our William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce. As Dean Innes mentioned a few moments ago, the center plays an important role in Maine's efforts to inform and affect economic development in Maine. The mission of the Cohen Center mirrors the professional endeavors in which he is now involved. Since leaving public life, Bill Cohen has served as chair and CEO of the Cohen Group, a strategic international business consulting firm based in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm University of Maine welcome to the former United States Secretary of Defense, the Honorable William S. Cohen.
Thank you very much. Boy, am I glad I waited for that introduction. I felt like one of those young second-string basketball players waiting for the coach. Now, coach, now. And Dean Innes, I'm sorry that I started to preempt President Hoff, but thank both of you for your very kind and generous remarks about my past career in politics and public service, and now associated here with the university. It's always a great feeling to come home and to be with so many people that I have had as supporters and friends over the years. Adlai Stevenson used to say, "I'm delighted to see so many of my friends here and so few of my supporters." But I can say I've had both, and I thank you so much for all of these years. Joe Westfall and Linda, Tim Woodcock, who have also been friends of mine for so many years. I thank you for being here. Mr. Irvin, thank you for being here today to pay tribute to our honored guests. I hope all of you have recovered from Maine Day. They've celebrated Cinco de Mayo in other parts of the country, but we celebrate Maine Day, and I hope you've all survived that. And I want to say what a special privilege it is for me to speak to you today about the center and about the superb work that the faculty and students have done here at the university. I think the center remains a significant focus on key trade and security issues in the international Northeast, the region comprising Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, Northern New England, and New York. And Canada is by far, they are by far our largest trading partner. And for many years, our countries have worked so closely together on our security issues, with NORAD being perhaps the most visible and significant security issue that we have together. We have prospered together, and we remain committed to defending each other. With the ever-increasing volume of trade crossing the border, the enhanced security concerns since September 11th, I think the international Northeast faces many new opportunities as well as challenges. I think that this center is uniquely positioned at this pivotal moment in history to address a range of issues that might otherwise prevent the region from fully participating in the growing hemispheric economy while maintaining that close security relationship. And there is no better person that I can think of to deliver the fourth William S. Cohen Lecture than the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney. As a native of Quebec, Baie-Comeau, Quebec. I just located it on the map just a short time ago, thanks to Tim Woodcock. But Baie-Comeau, very similar to Bangor, as a matter of fact, in terms of population, about 26,000 people. Bangor, I'm told now, is about 31,000. I always take pride when I get introduced. They will go through all the litany of introductions and the things that I've done, and I say, but you forgot to mention I was the mayor of the third largest city in Maine. And someone recently said, there are 3 large cities in Maine? But very similar in population and no doubt in character and integrity of the people. As Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Mulroney provided a critical contribution to one of the principal architects, I must say, of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement back in 1987 and also NAFTA back in 1992. He navigated his country through a series of, I would say, monumental and historic domestic reforms. And I think no one should have been surprised by Mr. Mulroney's achievements. He established himself on the national political stage in 1983 when he was elected leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. The following year, he led his party to the largest parliamentary victory in Canadian history. And then 4 years later, he became the first Canadian Prime Minister in 35 years to win back-to-back majority governments, all extraordinary feats. And of course, since leaving public office, the Canadians continue to be served by Mr. Mulroney, who has returned to the Montreal law firm of Ogilvy and Renault, and he serves on numerous boards and advisory council. I must tell you, it's been a personal privilege of mine to be able to associate with him on a private level now as I did on a public level before. We serve on several boards together, and I can attest that he is just as highly regarded for his business acumen as he has always been for his political capabilities. Of course, I don't know how Mr. Mulroney's law firm feels about having to share the news headlines with his son, Ben, who is the host of Canada's version of the American Idol. But I will tell you that his voice continues to resonate in global political circles on issues not only relevant but critical to us as well. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that life is action and passion, and we must share in that action and passion at the risk of being judged not to have lived. Brian Mulroney has shared in the action and passion of his times at every level. He continues to do so, and we all know that he lives at the very highest levels of our society. It is with extraordinary pleasure that I introduce this man to you. I will tell you that the United States, America, could not ask for a better friend. And I will tell you, we've never had a better friend. It's with great pleasure and honor that I present to you a personal friend, a recipient of Canada's highest honor, the Companion of the Order of Canada, and importantly, a true friend of the International Northeast, the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney. Thank you all. Thank you. Very much.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, my father's oldest brother left Quebec in difficult economic times and came to work in the paper mills in Maine, and he settled in Millinocket, Maine, and worked the paper mill there and lived his life there. It just occurred to me today that had my father come rather than my uncle, this might be the Brian Mulroney Institute at the University of Maine. Well, I'm very happy to be with you today, and I'm here because of my friendship with and my respect for Bill Cohen. This is a genuine Renaissance man, as you know, and you've known him for decades as a mayor and a United States representative and a senator and a defense secretary, and an individual who exemplified the integrity and vision and the achievement of many of Maine's most celebrated sons and daughters, and was recognized throughout the United States and elsewhere for that. But there's another dimension to Bill Cohen, and that is the individual as seen by others, other leaders outside of the United States of America. In 1986, at the G7 summit in Tokyo, I was at breakfast one morning, just before we got things going, and Prime Minister Thatcher and Chancellor Kohl and Prime Minister Nakasone and President Reagan and I were having coffee before the morning session. We started to talk, as we often did, about rising stars in other G7 countries. And when we got to the United States, I was struck by the commentary of Chancellor Kohl, who said, "I think that Senator Cohen of Maine is emerging as one of the most effective members of the United States Senate. He's intelligent, knowledgeable, reliable, and supportive in this complex world." The most striking thing about it, apart from the fact that it came from the Chancellor of Germany, a great man, was that Margaret Thatcher agreed with it. Because Margaret usually insisted that those things be said about her and nobody else. But it was quite interesting to me, knowing Bill and having had that view myself for so many years, how everyone there knew of Bill Cohen, and everyone there agreed with the assessment of his splendid personal qualities and his great personal achievement and his unique devotion to public service. And so I just want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen of Maine, that I'm here with great pride because of Bill Cohen, and I know you share the enormous pride we felt around the world in him, and I congratulate him and I thank him very much for all he's done for America and for the world. I served for a long time as Prime Minister, 9 years, and interesting things happen to you when you leave office. It's fun being there, but it's kind of interesting when you're out, especially if you retire and are not defeated, which I did. I got right in under the radar. Yeah. But interesting things happen to you. And the first thing that I did, I went to Orlando to go to a board meeting. We got caught in a snowstorm. And we were diverted to Detroit. And there was a lady from Northwest Airlines, public relations there, to greet me at the airport, and she said, "Prime Minister Mulroney, right over there is an electric cart. You get on that cart, it'll take you to the end of the airport, and you will make your connecting flight for Orlando." I said, "Well, thank you very much." I head over to the cart, which is being guarded by a young man, about 6'5", 280 pounds. And just as I arrive, a lady charges right behind me, up in front, and she says to this guy, "I have to have that cart right now." And he says, "You cannot have that cart." She says, "Why not?" "This cart is reserved for the former dictator from Canada." Oh, how quickly they forget. In fact, I was telling Bill one day that we were together in New York last week with President Clinton. We had a great time with him, our old friend. And I was telling him that I spoke at a fundraising dinner in Toronto. And I get in the elevator by myself with Michael O'Shea, and there's a lady there, no one else. Push the button and down we go. And she's looking at me and she said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." And did anybody ever tell you, "You look an awful lot like Brian Mulroney"? And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, it happens to be almost every day." And she said, "Gee, must make you mad, eh?" Of course, we had our own fellow who set the standard when he left office. One of my predecessors, Prime Minister Diefenbaker, great friend of Maine, he was elected Prime Minister in 1957. And there are lessons for all of the students here who are contemplating a career in politics. There are lessons in humility that you either learn or they'll be inflicted upon you. Diefenbaker makes his first speech down in Montreal at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. And he's sitting at the head table, and the waiter goes by, and he's got what we refer to as une paire de pinces, and he takes these little pieces of butter and puts them on the plate. Diefenbaker is talking to the chairman of the meeting. The guy goes by, and he stops at Mr. Diefenbaker's place, and he puts a square of butter on the plate. Mr. Diefenbaker said, "Excuse me, sir." He said, "Could I have another piece of butter?" And the waiter says, "I'm sorry, it's one piece of butter per person." And Diefenbaker says, "Do you know who I am?" The guy says, "No." He said, "I'm the Right Honorable John George Diefenbaker, the new Prime Minister of Canada, and I want another piece of butter." And the waiter says to Diefenbaker, "Do you know who I am?" Diefenbaker says, "No." He said, "I'm the guy who gives out the butter." Well, I always enjoyed two of Bill's old colleagues in the Senate. One night, and I still actually enjoy one of them because he's still there. I turned on C-SPAN late one night. Believe me, you've got to have an uninteresting nightlife to watch C-SPAN in Los Angeles as I did that night. Here I am watching it, and there was a couple of years ago, just before Bill left the Senate, and there was a big debate on the balanced budget amendment. And there was Senator Robert Byrd denouncing the balanced budget amendment. And as you know, Byrd is something of a Greek and Roman history scholar, and he's always spouting this in the Senate. And he said that night in the debate, and I jotted it down because I thought it was pretty good. He said, if Cicero were here, he'd vote against the balanced budget amendment. And Senator Strom Thurmond rose and said, I knew Cicero. And he was for the balanced budget amendment. Well, Bill tells, he's sending me I'm getting the hook. So I'd better refer to some of the remarks that I'd like to make today. The fundamental goal of government is to make a better world, a world that is safe from war and safe for democracy, a world that is free from deprivation and free from degradation. For 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union were the world's two superpowers, the leaders of the West and the East, of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the keepers, in President Kennedy's words, of a hard and a bitter peace. And then in 1985, there came to power in the Kremlin a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who questioned the assumptions of the Soviet system, ended the arms race and ultimately the Cold War, disbanded the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and finally, the tyranny of the Soviet Federation itself. I remember sitting across a conference table from him in a private meeting in the Kremlin, literally hours after he assumed office in March of 1985. And I have to tell you today in Maine that I never, ever thought that all those things that day would happen the way they did. There he was, flanked by Andrei Gromyko. You remember warm, cuddly, affectionate Andrei Gromyko. And this new leader of the Soviet Union spoke to me with confidence of the future, but gave precious few indications of the convulsive changes he was about to unleash, so profound as it turned out that he and his administration and his federation would be consumed by them. For Canada and the United States, the post-Cold War world offered unique opportunities and daunting challenges. We begin from a common heritage of democratic traditions and a common defense of liberty. There are reminders of that from the trenches of one war to the beaches of the next, places inscribed in the history of valor where Canadians and Americans have fought together and Canadians and Americans have died together in the defense of freedom. And because we and our allies have remained true to those values and had the courage and the strength to defend them in NATO and Korea and the Gulf and elsewhere, within the last 15 years, the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunited. A trade unionist, an electrician like my father, from Gdansk, became president of Poland. A dissident poet sat in the castle in Prague as communist regimes tumbled like dominoes across Central and Eastern Europe. And in the second Russian Revolution, the people of Moscow made a human wall around their parliament, and Soviet tanks that had crushed every single stirring of liberty for 70 years, now for the first time, dared not cross. Well, strong political leadership at that time ensured that we came safely through the worst, as President Reagan said to the British Parliament. If the United States is to maintain its role of world leadership in political and security matters, and it is, in my judgment, absolutely vital that it does, it must ensure, first of all, that this great economy does not falter or fail, because such failure would soon jeopardize and ultimately vitiate American capacity to persuade other nations to share its prescriptions for peace and prosperity around the world. You know, until September 11th, I believe that the next decades held two great challenges for the industrialized world under American leadership. First, international security questions, principally the role of China as it grows in economic strength and military capability to an impressive and challenging new degree. And secondly, international trade, in which I include the information and internet revolution, which offers the greatest single avenue for growing prosperity, civilizing relationships, and equalizing opportunities for all young men and women that the modern world has ever seen. As we know, however, our world has changed, perhaps forever, because a handful of terrorists flew planes into American landmarks on a beautiful Tuesday morning in September, killing 3,000 innocent men, women, and children. 6 decades ago, a generation of startled Americans awoke to discover that their country was under attack. Pearl Harbor changed America, and therefore the world. And now the children and the grandchildren of the Americans who went to war in 1941 have suffered their own day of infamy, and one that is no less memorable. The appalling atrocities of September 11th, acts that must be seen as a declaration of war not just on America, but on all civilized people. These acts, in my judgment, were crueler in conception and even more shocking than what happened in Hawaii. September 11th has changed America, and with it the world once again. In the, I believe, 18 or 20 months since the tragedy, and in the wake of swift military victories in Afghanistan and Iraq, I can tell you this, that if the American military was able to do what they did in such record time in 2001, it was to some significant degree because of the capabilities, the strength and the capabilities introduced into the American military by Secretary William Cohen. So our leaders have also urged us to get on with our lives. And this is what we, all of us as citizens, are doing, and so must our country. So what can we most usefully do at this moment? Well, I suppose everyone would have his list, but I think we can begin by completing the trade trilogy that will transform this hemisphere. Canada and the U.S. are in the vanguard of industrialized nations, building precisely such a foundation of economic growth and prosperity in which justice and freedom can flourish. As a new Prime Minister in 1984, God, I must have been about 17. Seems so long ago. I signaled President Reagan that Canada was interested in negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United States of America. In 1987, following more than 2 years of challenging negotiations, we reached agreement. President Reagan and I subsequently signed the massive and quite radical agreement, which came into effect on January 1, 1989. Now, I should tell you that some of my opponents in Canada, and I can mention them because I had so few of them. Some of my opponents said, well, you know, the problem is that Prime Minister Mulroney loves the Americans. And what he's trying to do with his Irish friend Reagan is make, in this free trade agreement, he wants to make Canada a carbon copy of the United States. Well, but that wasn't true. And there are fundamental differences between our two countries. For example, in the summer of 1987, the American Congress began the Iran-Contra hearings. And I was in Italy at the G7 summit with President Reagan. And he used to watch the hearings on CNN and come to the meetings in the morning quite morose. It was the only time that I'd ever seen him in our many years together where he wasn't happy and enthusiastic. He was, I won't say depressed, but certainly morose. Every morning. He watched this stuff at night on CNN. So he came in one day, I said, Ron, do not watch CNN. Watch Bonanza. Anything. He said, Brian, he said, you know, it's terrible. This thing is going to have a tremendous impact on me and my administration. And it's going to be awful. And sure enough, 3 weeks later, I was at the Prime Minister's summer residence in Harrington Lake, north of Ottawa, and I noticed a big black headline in the New York Times, and it said, Reagan's popularity plummets to 59%. And right there, I knew the difference between Canadians and Americans. It's language. The word plummet clearly does not mean the same thing in Canada as it does in the United States. But knowing Reagan, of course, he'd be upset. So I called him. He was at Camp David. And I said, well, Ron, how are you doing? And he said, awful, just awful, Brian. He said, I suppose you've seen that terrible poll in the Times. I said, Ron, I don't know how to break this to you. But on a good day, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and I combined don't have a 59% approval rating. Well, in Canada, after the deal was signed, we had to endure a vicious 3-year onslaught and unprecedented vitriolic personal attack. And I had to call and win a brutal general election campaign, fought tooth and nail by the present government, by the way, before we could enact the agreement into law. According to our opponents, it was going to be an unrelieved disaster, and Canada was going to lose its shirt. So what happened? Well, last year, two-way trade in goods and services exploded to $700 billion. Our trade and commerce is now $2 billion a day, more than $1.3 million a minute, every day of the year, the largest amount of commerce between any two countries in the history of the world. Canada is the #1 export market for 37 of the American states, and Canada buys more goods from the United States than Mexico and Japan combined. In fact, the United States last year did 3 times as much business with Canada, 3 times as it did with China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan combined. Canada is Maine's largest market. In 2002, two-way trade with Maine totaled almost $5 billion. and the two-way trade with New England totaled almost $35 billion. That's more than the GDP of 85% of the countries represented at the United Nations. Maine sent a quarter of its total foreign exports to Canada. Forest products exports are a major component of your trade. Canada also buys Maine's seafood. The Pine Tree State exported over $40 million worth of stationery and office supplies, and $40 million worth of computers, and $25 million worth of motor vehicle parts, and so on. And tourism adds millions to the exchange. In the year 2000, Canadians made 683,000 visits to Maine for one night or more and spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And Maine residents did about half that with us. In Ontario, just to indicate it's not a local phenomenon, for example, you remember that bridge there where President Bush and our Prime Minister went to have a meeting not so long ago, the Windsor-Detroit Bridge, the Ambassador Bridge. The value of goods crossing the Windsor-Detroit border point alone is greater than the total United States trade with Japan across one bridge to Detroit. Now, I should tell you that in 197 years of relations between our two countries, there hasn't been a shot fired in anger across our border. In 1812, there was a skirmish led by a few Irishmen. But in that war, as it's called, the War of 1812, because we have to celebrate any difference we have, in that war, we captured Detroit, and we gave it back. So who says Canadians are not nice people? Well, after the trade agreement and its effects, beneficial for both countries, although it remains controversial, I certainly recognize that. A decade and a half ago, the new president of Mexico began articulating his vision for the modernization of the Mexican economy. And the cornerstone of that great initiative was to be a free trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, NAFTA. And you remember the criticism immediately, the giant sucking sound. Everything was going to go down to Mexico. All the hockey players in Canada and the dancing girls in Vegas were going to Mexico. I've got no problem with the hockey players, but somebody's got to draw a line somewhere. Well, of course, this is pretty goofy stuff, because immediately thereafter, and not exclusively due to this, the United States of America created 24 million jobs in the next 8.5 years, something never before seen in the history of this republic. But in Mexican terms, the concept was revolutionary and marked a dramatic break with many past policies. In global terms, the concept was unusual in that it marked the first attempt to link, within a free trade zone, the economies of two mature, wealthy, technologically sophisticated trading countries, Canada and the United States, both G7 nations, with that of the equivalent of a developing nation with relatively limited democratic achievement in terms of politics and public policy and universities and business and judges and so on, compared with Canada and the United States. But in spite of the challenges and political risks, the three leaders envisioned the long-term benefits, and NAFTA was successfully negotiated and signed in San Antonio in October of 1992 by the presidents of the United States, Mexico, and myself. Based on the Canada-US experience, NAFTA has opened up the Mexican market of 100 million people, creating the richest, largest single market in the world. 400 million people, accounting for 1/3 of the total output of the world, approximately $12.5 trillion a year. And as a result, since NAFTA, in 7 years, Mexico has now surpassed Japan as America's #2 trading partner, although its economy is 1/12 the size of Japan's. Much of your future is now clearly a apart from your great links with Canada, also due south. And why is this so important to the United States? Well, America sells more to Chile with 16 million people than to India with 990 million. The United States sells about as much to Costa Rica as you do to all of Eastern Europe. And by 2010, the U.S. will be exporting more to Latin America than to all of Europe and Japan combined. It's therefore vital that the third act in the trilogy now be completed. You read in the papers every day that uncertainty and unpredictability are creeping into fragile democracies from Venezuela to Brazil to Argentina. After enormous progress towards democracy in the 80s and the 90s, you see what happens in Venezuela. You saw the catastrophe in Argentina, the challenges in Brazil. With Fujimori's departure, the enormous difficulties in Peru. This must now be drawn together. They have to be drawn together into greater prosperity and deeper democracy by a powerful act of political leadership that can only occur when the President of the United States of America decides that this is the #1 item on his agenda. If this occurs, one day, I hope one day soon, NAFTA's successor, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, shall include 34 countries with 800 million people, and the United States and Canada will have defined a powerful role for themselves at the very heart of a new free trade zone, stretching from Montreal to Monterrey, from Bangor to Buenos Aires, from Hawaii to Honduras, and from Easter Island to Nunavut at the tip of the Arctic Circle. We have, in short, accomplished much. But there are, however, new challenges that face us and opportunities open to us as we try to manage an intensifying economic relationship and cope with increasing threats to our shared values and security. Look, September 11th has changed everything. And it's certainly seen to this. These issues now are inseparable. North America is more than a free trade area. It's a community of values motivated by a deep belief in democracy, economic opportunity, tolerance, and the rule of law. It is 3 countries sharing a critical infrastructure of pipelines and telecommunication networks and rail and power lines. It is 3 closely integrated economies whose prosperity depends on free flows of people and goods and services between them. It is, in short, an area whose social, economic, and national security is indivisible. Our economic security relies on seamless borders within North America. Our security against global terrorism and criminality can only be ensured by acting together to protect our external borders before threats can reach any of our territories. Our values are only safe if we insist on practicing them and making them a compelling example for the world. It is essential, therefore, that we dedicate ourselves to protecting our shared continent together and to work together in the world acting in defense of these beliefs. The NAFTA partners must dedicate themselves as a matter of the greatest urgency to building an area of security in North America, one that denies terrorism a foothold on our continent and ensures uninterrupted legitimate flows among us. Customs and immigration practices and anti-terrorism policies and defense expenditures must be examined and, where possible, harmonized. Such common action is also essential to allow us to protect the great north-south flow of goods and people and technology that underpins our shared prosperity. There can be no fortress America. There can be no fortress Canada. We're in this together. Our internal borders will only be smart if our external perimeter is secure. Why would I have to go through, a nice fellow like me, have to go through a whole series of security things and passports and all this stuff to come to Bangor? when a guy from Germany can go to London with no passports and no duties and no anything. What we have to do is ensure that our external perimeter is completely secure. But once inside, once we have ensured that no undesirables get in, those of us who are here must be given full freedom to function effectively, to enhance our lives and our prosperity. We may need new political institutions to heighten vigilance and direct concrete actions which gives all of North America more certainty against the unprecedented threat of terrorism. And we must make our internal borders work in our shared interest, rather than succumbing to the false temptation of sealing them off against each other to protect security. Doing so would be a signal victory for the terrorists. We must also protect our shared economic security against political expediency. An economic relationship that is so close and so strongly based in mutual reliance should not be the subject of the misuse of draconian trade instruments. The sometimes arbitrary application of trade remedies in North America can have the most hurtful consequences on communities and on whole regions in both of our countries. They serve no one but special interests, and they hurt every single consumer. Though the application of such measures has fallen significantly since the conclusion of NAFTA, each instance is like a violent lurch in a stable relationship, a rude assault on the fundamental goals of a grand continental partnership. In my view, we should press for a common standard of trade remedy, embracing the rule of law rather than the rule of power. This, of course, will require an uncommon degree of political will. It's not easy. There are great pressures on the government of the United States, government of Canada. Some people want the government to go this way and someone else another way. It's hard to satisfy everybody. Look, the only perfect government seen ever, certainly in modern history, was mine. And everybody knows that. Well, some years ago, the legendary New York Times columnist Scotty Reston came to lunch with me at 24 Sussex, the Prime Minister's official residence in Ottawa. And after an impressive tour d'horizon, Mr. Reston said, "You know, Prime Minister, for the last 25 years, I have opposed every single policy that your friend Ronald Reagan has ever stood for." And then he added, "And during that same period, Ronald Reagan was twice elected governor of California and twice elected president of the United States." This self-deprecatory observation I thought memorable because of its infrequency at the New York Times, was delivered somewhat ruefully, as if Mr. Reston were actually perplexed by his own admission. But to so wise an observer as Reston, the answer surely would have been very clear. It's called leadership, that ineffable and sometimes magical quality that sets some men and women apart so that millions will follow them as they conjure up new visions and invite their countrymen to dream big and exciting dreams. In his seminal work on leadership, and I'm sure it's an important book in your library here at the university, James McGregor Burns segregates transactional from transforming leadership. He writes that it is the transforming leader who raises the level of human conduct of both leaders and led, who responds to fundamental hopes and expectations, and who may transcend and even seek to reconstruct the political system rather than simply operate within it. Many people suggest that the great inexorable currents of history themselves and not individual leaders seal our fate. In my judgment, however, Carlyle was on target when he observed that the right man or woman in the right place at the right time can completely change the course of history. I believe that to be true because I was there to see it happen. The events of September 11th have had a similar effect. In the blunt assessment of President Truman at another moment, There are no great men, he said. There are only ordinary men who rise to meet great challenges. As the months unfold and we watch a president hitherto inexperienced in international affairs and untested in battle, and we watch him grapple with the most explosive challenge imaginable, we witness a new and rather unanticipated profile in leadership emerge. And one of the great things about the United States is the manner in which it consistently, over generations and over centuries, has produced leadership, sometimes unexpected, but oftentimes very effective. In a brilliant address delivered some years ago, Ted Sorensen, himself a skilled observer of powerful leaders, as special counsel to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, said, "Once in office, those who wish to stand up and stand out and leave something enduring behind must build new institutions, not new images. They must look to the next generation and not to the next election. They must talk in terms of fundamental values and not merely costs. They must appeal to our hopes as well as our needs, to what we long to be and to what we know is right." That, he said, is leadership. Well, time is the ally of leaders who place the defense of principle ahead of the pursuit of popularity. And history has little time for the marginal roles played by the carpers and complainers, and less for their opinion. History tends to focus, be it in a community like this or in Washington, D.C. or London, on the builders, the deciders, the leaders, because they are the men and women whose contributions have in many ways shaped the destiny of their nations. Teddy Roosevelt, I always thought, had such courageous leaders in mind when he spoke many years ago at La Sorbonne and said, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who spends himself in a worthy cause, and who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who have known neither victory nor defeat." Canada and the United States of America, like other privileged nations, are often extremely resistant to change. But deep and important structural changes are indispensable right now to maintain a growing economy and ensure the flourishing of peace and liberty, and they can only be brought about by a firm expression of political will. As Maureen Dowd observed some years ago, in a nation, she was speaking of her country, but it applies elsewhere, in a nation ruled by polls and ratings, where even newspapers hire focus groups to see what kind of news the readers want, we are losing sight, she said, of something we should have learned when we were teenagers. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right. In fact, transforming leadership, leadership that makes a significant difference in the life of a nation, as Bill Cohen and his contributions have. That kind of leadership recognizes that political capital is acquired to be spent in great causes for one's country. And this is precisely such a time. Presidents and prime ministers are not chosen to seek popularity. They are chosen to provide leadership. There are times when voters must be told not what they want to hear, but what they have to know. And what they have to know is a quotation from the book of Proverbs that is inscribed on the Peace Tower in the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, which says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." Leaders must have vision, and they must find the courage to fight for the policies that will give that vision life. Leaders must govern not for easy headlines in 10 days, but for a better America in 10 years. and they must be ready to endure the attacks that often accompany profound or controversial change while they await the distant and compelling sounds of a verdict that only history and a more reflective nation can offer in the fullness of time. 2 years ago, the Kennedy Library saluted President Gerald R. Ford with the Profiles in Courage Award for pardoning Richard Nixon. It was an historic decision, deeply unpopular for Mr. Ford at the time, but as it turned out, right for America. I can remember a lunch in Colorado with Jerry Ford, with Jerry and Betty, when he said to Mila and me, "Brian, if I had not pardoned Richard Nixon, I would have been reelected. But by pardoning, I think I made a great contribution to the continuity and well-being of my country." Well, in an insightful and I thought elegant essay in the New York Times, David Gergen, counselor to 4 presidents, wrote that in saluting President Ford that day for his courage in making a tough decision, the trustees of the Kennedy Library were actually doing much more. And I quote, "They are telling leaders everywhere to pay less attention to daily polls and more attention to their inner voices. Give up the slavish obedience to popular opinion so embedded in politics today, and take up the standard of what's right, even when it threatens one's political survival." As Jerry Ford found, he wrote, "You may be condemned by millions, but one day, perhaps a quarter of a century later, you will win an honored place in the history of your country." The VE celebrations of the victory over Nazism over 50 years ago and the VJ celebrations in August of the same year would never, ever have taken place without the leadership of the United States of America and her principal allies. The simple reality of world affairs now is this: without U.S. leadership, nothing happens. Without U.S. leadership and the support of her allies, there would have been no semblance of peace, as fragile and elusive as it is in the Middle East. No hope for peace in Northern Ireland, no restoration of peace in Haiti, and no promise of peace in the former Yugoslavia. It simply wouldn't have happened. Only the United States and her allies have the unique combination of vast economic strength, extraordinary military power, and a history of willingness to bear burdens in the defense of freedom. And so it is again today. Because the global community needs strong leadership and needs direct American leadership and vision. Job said that young men have visions and old men dream dreams. Well, great countries need both. And America needs that kind of leadership, as does the world, to deal with an enemy I think as diabolical as the world has ever seen. For me, the great strength of the United States of America is not measured in tanks and planes. It's measured in something quite different and was best captured in remarks by Judge Learned Hand, in my judgment, the greatest American judge who was never appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States, from the appeals court in the state of New York. And he was addressing a group of immigrants to the United States, Catholics and Protestants and Jews from around the world, Central and Eastern Europe, almost 60 years ago. And he told them what the United States was about. And I think that his definition applies not only to you, but to many others. He said that, in his judgment, it had to do with what he referred to as the spirit of liberty. And he said that the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty seeks to understand the minds of other men and other women. The spirit of liberty weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty, he said, knows that not even a sparrow falls to earth unheeded. And the spirit of liberty is the spirit of him who near 2,000 years ago taught mankind a lesson that it has never quite learned and never quite forgotten, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. This, to me, symbolizes the magnificence and excellence of the United States of America. This virtue. And I say to you today that if this value is inculcated in your children and your grandchildren, as I'm sure it shall be, 100 years from now, the United States of America will remain for your children what it has been now for 200 years, the greatest democratic republic that the world has ever seen. And if all of us in our respective countries remember that freedom and liberty are the very pillars of our national democracy, we can collectively make a contribution to the well-being of mankind that will bring honor to every single one of our nations, and much more importantly, will also bring peace and prosperity to every corner of this world. And I thank you very much.
All right? Help yourself. Mr. Prime Minister, I want to thank you for that marvelous and inspiring combination of experience, insight, and, yes, vision. It was wonderful. I feel tremendously privileged to have been able to come here and hear you today. We're now going to ask you and Secretary Cohen to stand here at the podium to respond to questions from members of our audience. Presenting these questions, which have been written on cards during this morning's program, is Joshua Smith. Joshua is a University of Maine doctoral student studying Canadian-American relations. Joshua?
Good morning. It's a very great pleasure to be here. But as a historian, I would like to remind everybody that Bangor during the War of 1812 was captured and given back. And one must wonder, had it not been given back, would Secretary Cohen now be Prime Minister Cohen? Prime Minister Mulroney, our first question is for you. In light of the 9/11 events and continuing concerns of terrorism, what additional methods would you suggest to facilitate the added safety for both the United States and Canada, given our long and often remote, common, and largely unmanned border?
Well, I think I touched on that briefly. I think the answer is really to do what the Europeans have done with the European Union. You make it all as close to impossible as possible for people to get in to the United States or to Canada. In other words, you do your pre-screening. You check everybody who's seeking to come. You check their backgrounds. Check them as often as you want. Ensure that the criteria that we use are identical in admitting people. We harmonize the policies to ensure that the leaders of the United States and the leaders of Canada are comfortable completely with the concept. Once Mr. X arrives from Holland or from Germany or from wherever, having passed having met the criteria and passed a series of very difficult and demanding tests, relatively speaking, to what we have now. Once he sets foot in the United States, he should have relatively free access to Canada. We should be able to function within our combined territories as freely as they do now in Europe. As I say, it is difficult for us to get to Europe, as you notice when you go. But once you're there, you go everywhere. And a German citizen, as I said, goes to London. A French citizen, they don't have passports. They don't have border tests. They have nothing. Why? Because of the Schengen agreement, everything is now concentrated towards occupying the territory collectively. I think if we seal off the border, you're quite right. We got, what, almost a 5,000-mile border. How are you going to do this? What we should do is open it up, make it, but only after we have taken all of these measures to secure the perimeter. And I think we can do, look, it's being done elsewhere. We can certainly do it. And I think once the emotion subsides somewhat, this will be done to the great benefit of the people of the United States and Canada.
And another question for Prime Minister Mulroney. In your opinion, sir, what influenced Prime Minister Chrétien's decision not to join or support the war in Iraq?
Glad you asked that question.
Well, I don't know. If I were still there, it would have been a different decision, I guarantee you that. I can tell you what I've said in Canada, that in my judgment, for 135 years, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia have made common cause in the defense of liberty and freedom around the world. We fought together in World War I, in World War II, in Korea, during the Cold War, and in the Gulf. And we were told at a seminal moment in the history of the United States in the fight against terrorism, we were told, we were asked for assistance by the President of the United States. And as I understand it, the Government of Canada said, really, no. We're going to repudiate this historic alliance with the Americans, the Australians, the Brits, and the Canadians. And we're going to give you new friends. The Chinese, the Russians, and the Germans. I say, thank you very much, but no thanks. I'm going to stick with my old friends and allies. That's my position.
And again, for Prime Minister Mulroney, the inevitable Quebec sovereignty question. Sir, now that Quebecers have elected a Liberal government, how do you see the future of the Quebec sovereignty movement?
Well, I had dinner last night with the new Premier of Quebec, who was one of my cabinet ministers. When I brought him into cabinet, he was the youngest cabinet minister in Canadian history. And he's turned out to be he was a great success, and I think he'll be a great success as Premier. He's a strong Canadian, strong federalist, committed to cooperation. And I think this has been a very significant blow to the separatist movement in Quebec. But I don't think it's a lethal blow. This is with us. This is part of our psyche now in Quebec. And anybody who tells you that separatism is extinguished as a result of an election defeat really knows very little about Canada. I think Mr. Chara has an opportunity to do great things with the new Prime Minister of Canada when he comes on the scene, and I think they'll do some things of significance. But you know, when a report was made in 1840 to the Queen about the situation in Canada, the report went back and said I have found two nations warring within the bosom of a single state. And this is the linguistic reality of Canada. It was like that in 1759, and to some lesser extent, it's always there. So this is not something that's going to be extinguished. Il faut, et je le dis bien pour les Franco-Américains qui sont ici, qu'il faut reconnaître que la langue française et la culture française exigent une capacité d'épanouissement éternel. C'est à l'avantage du Canada que nous ayons justement cette dimension linguistique différente et importante à notre personnalité. Ça nous permet de jouer un rôle vital, différent d'ailleurs des États-Unis, au niveau international et dans des instances les plus importantes comme le sommet de la francophonie que nous avons participé à créer. Alors la langue et la culture française sont indispensables pour le rayonnement du Canada moderne. Et personnellement, je crois qu'on est en mesure d'assurer son épanouissement sans le séparatisme. On peut le faire à l'intérieur d'un Canada uni. Et c'est mon souhait. So I think that Premier Charest is going to do a very good job in enhancing Canadian unity while protecting and enhancing the splendor of the French language and culture throughout Canada. Thank you.
And again, for the Prime Minister. During the years you were Prime Minister, you signed the NAFTA agreement, cleaned up the public finances, and instituted the goods and services tax. How do you feel about the Liberal government taking all the credit for all your hard work?
Well, who was the American who said life is fair? I'm kind of flattered, actually. They campaigned against every one of these things, and they said they were going to tear them up. And then they endorsed every one of them. Look, the policies are good for Canada. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And nothing is more valid in terms of public policy than to have a controversial issue, important controversial initiatives, endorsed by your political opponents. When Mr. Chrétien came to office, he could have adopted his policies that he campaigned on, or mine. And I thank him for the good judgment in choosing the latter. So they seem to have benefited Canada enormously, so much so that one day he actually forgot himself, and he was speaking in Europe, and he announced to this audience how successful his policies had been and how pleased he was to have brought them in. So I was happy to hear that. And I said, you know, Paul Martin was the finance minister up there until he was fired by Mr. Chrétien and is now going to be the successor as prime minister. He was a good finance minister, but he took all of our policies too. And I said what I think is true. It irritates Paul a little bit to hear it, but I think it's true. I said, look, we planted the garden and Paul got to pick the flowers. So there's nothing wrong with that. As long as Canada benefits, I'm okay with it.
I think we could be here all day asking questions, but we have time for one last question, and this is for Secretary Cohen. Sir, in the aftermath of September 11, how can Canada best contribute to North American security?
Before I answer the question, I first want to say what an extraordinary experience it was to be here today. We heard a real tour de force from a real leader and one of the greatest friends that this country could ever have. And I'm pleased that I was able to invite the Right Honorable Brian Mulroney here. And I might say there was not a trace of Ireland in that French accent and brilliant display of his bilingual talents. But I just want to say I was somewhat I'm not stunned, but I was surprised with the strength of the ovation and its durability. And I was thinking, don't let it go on too long. He just may run again. And wouldn't that be great for Canada? I think the Prime Minister's already answered that question directly in terms of what the U.S. and Canada can do collectively or in combination in terms of providing security for our two countries. I think as far as the threat of terror is concerned, it's going to be with us a long, long time. It's a war in a different context. It has no definable enemy, and you will never know when it's over. Unlike World War I or II or Korea, or even Vietnam when there was a declaration it's over, or even now with Iraq. You will never know when it's over, because now we don't have to contend necessarily with other countries, with national governments. We now have to contend with subnational groups or even individuals, be they maniacal, messianic, whatever the characterization. They now have access to the power of knowledge. And that knowledge, they can construct weapons of mass destruction. Most immediately it comes to mind, of course, is biological agents and weapons. We have seen the SARS epidemic and what it has been able to do. And I like to think of the SARS epidemic and biological weapons in the context of saying it's like ink spreading on tissue paper. Once something is released, it's very hard to contain it. And so we have to really work hard with all of our international friends. And that's why it becomes very important that we not allow our politics to become fractionalized. We can't defend ourselves, frankly. Neither Canada or the United States working alone will be able to defend ourselves. We have to have allies the world over. We have to nurture those allies. We have to cultivate those relationships. We have to share information with all of those countries. And when you have Great Britain, for example, another great friend, of course, of the United States and a partner in this war in Iraq. But when their police knock on doors in the middle of the night, and they break down those doors and they find individuals who have in their possession ricin. Ricin being one of the most deadly poisons on the face of the earth. How do you make ricin? You make it out of a bean. And it's a bean which can have very innocuous and even healthful opportunities. Castor beans. We make castor oil out of castor beans. You can also make ricin out of castor beans. How do you know the difference? How do you know what people are doing? So what we have to do is to share intelligence on a global basis. We have to be able to prevent those individuals who, as the Prime Minister has said, coming to our country, but also once in our country being able to get hands on substances and technology which allow them to try to destroy our civilization. So Canada can begin, I think, to answer it more directly, by rebuilding its armed forces, which I am sorry to say they have allowed to fall into a state of disrepair. I think it's sad and a sad commentary that Canada no longer contributes as much as it needs to contribute to have a very viable, strong national defense. That would be step one that they can do. And it doesn't have to be replicating what we have in our defense capability. It doesn't have to be F-18s or Joint Strike Fighters or F-22s or destroyers, but there has to be a capability which they can commit with the United States and our allies to missions such as Iraq, missions such as we had in Kosovo and elsewhere. They have to have that kind of capability at a minimum. But then secondly, they have to be willing to work with the United States on the basis that this really is a global threat. And I must say the one thing that is most discouraging to me when I travel the world is I find that other countries do not feel the same sense of anxiety or concern that we do here in the United States. They feel that this war that has been unleashed is against the United States and against some of its principal allies, but primarily against the United States. And they can sit on the sidelines. They don't have to be that concerned. The attack was upon the trade towers, upon the Pentagon. The fact of the matter is that every single person in this world is now vulnerable. The SARS epidemic is just a slight example of that. But think about it, if something gets loose, be it the SARS, but be it any kind of biological agent, be it smallpox, or some variation of smallpox. Suddenly, something that is released in one tiny country or one large country, given globalization and travel, suddenly is on your doorstep. And so everybody has to be persuaded now that this is something, it's a global threat. It requires a global response. And as Brian Mulroney said, we're all in this together. There are no rear lines, there's no safety, there are no sanctuaries. You can go to any part of the country thinking you're in a rural area, you'll be safe, you won't be safe. Everybody is in this together. And I think the Canadian government can begin rebuilding their defense structure, rebuilding its relationship with the United States, and frankly, it's been impaired. I don't think we should mince any words about it. There has been an impairment in that relationship because, as the Prime Minister has said, if you are in need, in dire need of assistance, you turn to your friends. And if your friends say, we're sorry, we're not with you, no matter what you say, that will leave an imprint. We will get over it. We will forgive it, so to speak. We will not, however, forget it easily, because you don't want to be in the situation of sending our young people off to fight and die in a war that has implications for the defense of the free world and not have the support of your closest allies. So I think that's at the beginning. I could give you a long senatorial answer, but you've had the benefit of having one of the most eloquent and most dynamic speakers in the world appear before you today. And again, I want to express my deep appreciation for you, Brian.
Prime Minister Mulroney, Secretary Cohen, thank you for your comments and for your participation in today's program. Before our formal presentation began this morning, Prime Minister Mulroney and Secretary Cohen met with a group of University of Maine students from Canada and students in our Canadian-American Studies program. Those students appreciated your taking the time to speak with them. They'll remember the opportunity to interact with you this morning as a highlight of their academic careers here at the University of Maine. Prime Minister, we hope you've enjoyed your first visit to the University of Maine and that you will return to see us very soon again. We do have a few gifts for you to take home when you return to Montreal. From our point of view, one of Canada's most important exports is students. Including, some might say especially, but including students who play hockey. Canadian citizens have made immeasurable contributions to the great success of Black Bear men's ice hockey since the program began in 1977. Perhaps the best known is Paul Kariya, generally considered to be the best U.S. college hockey player ever. And although his number 9 is retired, we thought it appropriate to give a guest of your stature a genuine Black Bear hockey jersey with the number of our most famous star. Here it is.
I have to tell you something. When I grew up in Baie-Comeau, this pulp mill town, paper mill town, was owned by the Chicago Tribune in northern Quebec. My father was an electrician. We had 6 kids. Life was not easy for anybody in those towns, but everybody got along. But in those days, I was a hockey player. And I, like everybody else in northern Quebec, wanted to play in the NHL for the Montreal Canadiens. I did okay. I was playing junior B hockey. I was getting along. Some people said I had a little talent. So I go to see my father, who was the electrician, on a Sunday night after the startup in the paper mill. So I said, Dad, you know, because what we did then, you either played hockey or you went into the apprentice program in the mill, you know, to be a plumber or what have you, and that's the way it went. And so I went to see my father and I said, Dad, you know, I think what I'd like to do is sign the junior B contract, and I'd like to play hockey in the NHL someday. My father looked at me and he said, Brian, get yourself a good education, because there's no money in sports.
And while Paul Correa is certainly a most famous product of the University of Maine, he is not the only one. We also count among our former students the world's best-selling author, Stephen King. It's my pleasure to present you with a copy of Stephen's newest novel, From a Buick 8, with a personalized note from the author. To mark a special place on your bookshelf for that novel, we'd also like to give you a handsome set of University of Maine bookends. We hope they'll provide a fond reminder of your visit with us today. And Secretary Cohen, we have a gift for you as well. As a former instructor in our College of Business, and someone who has been a great friend of this university for many years, you are clearly part of the University of Maine family. We'd like to take another step in formalizing that relationship today by presenting you with this certificate signifying honorary lifetime membership in the University of Maine Alumni Association. Prime Minister Mulroney and Secretary Cohen, thank you again for participating in this memorable event. To our audience, thank you for joining us. I think we're now going to hear from the band.